December 17, 1944, Bullingen, Belgium. A frozen crossroads village in the Ardennes that most maps do not bother to name. A column of German armoured vehicles from Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, has just rolled through an American position that was abandoned hours earlier. The Americans pulled back in the chaos of the first morning of the Ardennes offensive. What they left behind is scattered across the snow. Kampfgruppe Piper's men captured roughly 50,000 gallons of American gasoline at Bullingen that morning, fuel they desperately needed to keep their panzers rolling west. American prisoners were forced at gunpoint to help refuel the German vehicles. But it was not the gasoline that left the deepest impression on the German troops who swept through those abandoned American foxholes and supply points. It was what else they found. In the bottom of a foxhole the Americans had dug the night before, half covered by a poncho, were small wax-coated cardboard boxes printed in English, K-Rations, standard issue. Inside one was a tin of processed cheese, a packet of biscuits, hard candy, chewing gum, a small envelope of soluble coffee, real coffee, not the roasted barley and acorn mixture German troops had been drinking for years, and tucked along the side, a 4-pack of cigarettes, Chesterfields, sealed, dry, 4 American cigarettes in a single meal ration. A second box held another meal, more coffee, 4 more cigarettes. A third box held 4 more cigarettes, 12 cigarettes in total. 1 day's food for 1 American private, and it contained more real coffee and more real tobacco than most German soldiers on that offensive had seen in a month. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. If this was 1 American soldier's daily ration, and a squad had 12 men, then a single American squad was carrying 144 cigarettes and 12 packets of real soluble coffee, just for 1 day. German soldiers on that same offensive were officially allocated 6 cigarettes per day when they could get them at all. By December 1944, many could not. The question that German soldiers in half a dozen captured positions across the Ardennes were asking that same morning is the question this entire investigation is built around. What kind of country can afford to give every private soldier what a German sergeant cannot get? That question sounds like it belongs in an economics textbook. It does not. It belongs on a battlefield, because the answer to it decided the outcome of the war in Western Europe as surely as any tank battle or bombing campaign. Coffee and cigarettes did not win the war. But the system that could deliver them, to every foxhole, every day, across an ocean and a continent, was the same system that delivered the fuel, the ammunition, the replacement parts, and the reserves that buried the Wehrmacht in 1944 and 1945. And the fact that the American military chose to include coffee and cigarettes as a standard part of that system tells you something about how the United States thought about the men who did the fighting, something the German High Command never understood and never matched. To see where this story begins, we cannot start in the Ardennes. We cannot even start in this war. We have to go back 80 years before D-Day, to a different American army in a different century, to understand why coffee was not a luxury in the United States military. It was a weapon. 1861, the American Civil War. The Union Army is mobilizing the largest military force the Western Hemisphere has ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of young men from farms and factories and small towns are being formed into regiments and marched south. They carry Springfield rifles. They carry ammunition. They carry hardtack, the dense flour and water biscuit that would become the most hated food in American military history. And they carry coffee. Every Union soldier was issued 36 pounds of coffee per year. That is not a misprint. 36 pounds, per man, per year. Green coffee beans, unroasted, packed in sacks that rode in the supply wagons alongside the powder and shot. But coffee had already been woven into the American military identity for nearly a century before the Civil War began. After the British imposed a tax on tea in the 1770s, drinking coffee became a patriotic act. In a letter to his wife Abigail in July 1774, future President John Adams wrote that he had drank coffee every afternoon since, and had borne it very well, that tea must be universally renounced, and that he must be weaned from it, and the sooner the better. From the Revolution forward, coffee was the American drink, and the American soldier drank more of it than anyone. Jon Grinspan, a curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, spent years reading through Civil War diaries and letters. He went in looking for the grand themes: war, slavery, freedom, Lincoln. What he found was coffee. The word coffee appeared in Union soldiers' diaries more often than the words war, bullet, cannon, slavery, mother, or Lincoln. One soldier wrote home with evident surprise at his own survival, saying that what keeps him alive must be the coffee. Grinspan later said that you can only ignore what they are talking about for so long before you realize that is the story. The ritual of making it was as important as the drinking. When a Union regiment halted for the night, the scene was the same from Virginia to Mississippi. One diarist described little campfires rapidly increasing to hundreds in number, shooting up along the hills and plains. The encampment would buzz with the sound of thousands of hand grinders crushing beans. Soon, tens of thousands of tin coffee pots, the soldiers called them muckets, gurgled with fresh brew. The men crushed the beans with their rifle butts. They used bayonet handles. In 1859, the Sharps Rifle Company had begun manufacturing a carbine with a hand-cranked grinder built into the buttstock. The grinder was designed for processing grain and horse feed, not coffee. But the legend that Union soldiers used it to grind coffee beans took hold almost immediately and has never been fully dislodged. Whether any of them actually did is still debated. But the fact that the story persists tells you something about the culture. These were men for whom coffee was so central to daily life that a legend about grinding beans with your rifle felt entirely plausible. Civil War veteran John D. Billings of the 10th Massachusetts Battery wrote a memoir called Hardtack and Coffee that captured the ritual better than any official history. He described how a soldier would drop out of the marching column, build a small campfire, cook his coffee, take a nap behind the nearest shelter, and when he woke, hurry on to overtake his company. The officers knew it happened. They allowed it. They understood, in the practical way that American officers have always understood their men, that a soldier with coffee in his belly would march farther and complain less than a soldier without it. The Confederacy, on the other hand, was cut off from coffee imports by the Union naval blockade almost from the first month of the war. Confederate soldiers were reduced to roasting rye, sweet potatoes, peanuts, chicory, and acorns to make something that resembled coffee in color but in nothing else. General George Pickett is said to have received a homemade coffee substitute from his wife, and written back with the desperate enthusiasm of a man who has lowered his standards considerably, declaring that no mocha or java ever tasted half so good as this rye and sweet potato blend. Coffee had been officially added to the American military ration in 1832, replacing the daily whiskey or rum allotment that had been standard since the Revolution. The change was driven by temperance sentiment, but the result was that for the next 112 years, through every conflict the United States fought, the American soldiers' daily rhythm was built around coffee, not tea, not alcohol, not water, coffee. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, coffee was not merely part of the ration, it was the ration. Everything else was organized around it. And the man who designed the system that would deliver it to millions of soldiers across 2 oceans was a physiologist from the University of Minnesota named Ancel. In 1941, with American entry into the war increasingly certain, the War Department asked Keyes to design a compact, non-perishable, ready-to-eat meal that a soldier could carry in his pocket during assault operations. Keyes went to a grocery store in Minneapolis. He bought hard biscuits, dry sausage, hard candy, and chocolate. He assembled a 28-ounce package delivering roughly 3,200 calories and tested it on soldiers at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. The reviews were lukewarm. The soldiers rated the meals palatable and better than nothing, which by military standards counted as a success. The package was designated the K-Ration, with the letter K reportedly chosen to honor Keyes himself, though the Army also liked that K was phonetically distinct from the existing C and D ration designations. By 1942, K-Rations were in mass production, and by 1943 they were feeding millions of American soldiers on every front. The K-Ration came in 3 units: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each one was sealed in a wax-coated cardboard box, small enough to fit in a cargo pocket. The wax coating was not a small detail. It was engineered to keep the contents dry in rain, mud, surf, and snow. But the soldiers quickly discovered that the coating served a second purpose that no one at the Subsistence Research and Development Laboratory in Chicago had anticipated. The wax-coated cardboard burned beautifully. A single ration box, crumpled and lit, produced a hot, clean flame that lasted just long enough to boil water in a canteen cup. Within weeks of the first K-Rations reaching combat units, the ritual was established. Open the box, set aside the food, tear the empty box into strips, stack the strips, light them, balance the canteen cup on a rock or a helmet, and brew coffee. Roger P. Casey of the 30th Infantry Division later wrote that the wax-impregnated box, when set on fire, would burn slowly and just long enough to heat up a canteen cup of water for coffee, and that it was a luxury to them. The breakfast unit contained a tin of chopped ham and eggs or veal loaf, biscuits, a compressed fruit bar, sugar tablets, a stick of chewing gum, a packet of instant soluble coffee, and a 4-pack of cigarettes with matches. The dinner unit replaced the coffee with a powdered drink mix, but included its own 4-pack of cigarettes. The supper unit carried bouillon or a chocolate bar, and 4 more cigarettes. Read those numbers again. One American soldier eating K-Rations for a single day received 12 cigarettes and at least 1 packet of real soluble coffee as part of his standard field ration, not as a bonus. Not as a special issue, as a baseline. The cigarettes were commercial brands: Chesterfield, Camel, Philip Morris, Old Gold, Raleigh, Chelsea, Fleetwood, and occasionally Lucky Strike. The coffee was supplied by firms including Nestlé, whose Nescafé brand became the primary source of soluble coffee for American military rations. A soldier could brew it using the wax-coated ration box itself as kindling to boil water in his canteen cup. The box burned hot, burned clean, and the men figured this out within days of receiving the first shipments. The C ration, which was bulkier and used when vehicles could bring supplies forward, also included soluble coffee in its B unit, along with sugar tablets. Beginning in March 1943, each C ration B unit included a small 3-cigarette pack, though this was discontinued later that year and replaced with other accessory items. The Army's own assessment of the K-Ration included a passage that reveals how seriously the military took these items. It stated that an excellent feature of the K-Ration was the cigarette component, noting that cigarettes were among the hardest things to supply, and that while carrying priority made it difficult to justify placing cigarettes in the same class as food and ammunition, they were near it. That last phrase deserves to sit for a moment. Near it. The United States Army was officially stating, in an internal logistics assessment, that cigarettes were nearly as important as ammunition. This was not an accident. This was doctrine. The American military had decided, based on experience going back to the Civil War, that the man in the foxhole was a human being first and a weapon system second, and that if you wanted the weapon system to function, you had to take care of the human being. This philosophy had a price tag. American soldiers consumed an average of 32.5 pounds of coffee per person per year during the war. That figure comes from military procurement records. For comparison, rationed American civilians were consuming about 8.5 pounds per year during the same period. The troops were drinking roughly 4 times what the people at home were allowed to buy, and the people at home were being asked to accept the shortage because the army had claimed the supply. In November 1942, the War Production Board took control of all coffee imports into the United States and placed coffee on civilian rationing. Each eligible adult over the age of 15 was limited to 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks. The rationing lasted until July 1943. The reason was simple. The military needed the coffee more. The cigarette numbers were even more staggering. In 1943, American tobacco companies produced a record 290 billion cigarettes. 30% of that production went overseas, directly into the hands of servicemen. Across the entire war, the Army, as the lead procurement agent for military cigarettes, distributed by one estimate nearly 350 billion cigarettes to roughly 17 million servicemen through rations, morale items, and post-exchange sales. Soldiers could also buy discounted packs of 20 at Army post-exchanges for a fraction of the civilian price. The result was that an American combat soldier in the European theatre had access to between 1.5 and 2 packs of cigarettes per day. The coffee saturated American military culture so thoroughly that it may have even changed the drinking habits of the countries the Americans liberated. According to a widely repeated origin story, American soldiers in Italy, encountering the strong Italian espresso, found it too concentrated for their tastes and watered it down. Italian baristas supposedly began calling this diluted version Café Americano, the American coffee. Whether the story is precisely true has never been confirmed, but the name persists on coffee shop menus around the world to this day. And the connection between American soldiers and their insistence on familiar coffee is documented beyond any doubt. The supply of cigarettes was treated so seriously that when it failed, even briefly, the consequences were immediate and severe. During the Battle of the Bulge, frontline cigarette deliveries stopped entirely for a period because service of supply troops in Paris had been diverting cigarette shipments to the French black market. The theft became a front-page scandal in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. The army investigated and ultimately court-martialed multiple officers and well over 100 enlisted men from the 716th Railway Operating Battalion. The fact that the army treated the theft of cigarettes from frontline troops as a serious criminal matter in the middle of the largest battle on the Western Front tells you everything about where cigarettes sat in the hierarchy of military priorities. Every like on this video is a small gesture, but it helps keep stories like these visible to the audience that cares about getting the history right. The real history, with the numbers, the names, and the details that most channels skip. Now hold those numbers in your head, because we need to cross the line and look at what the German soldier was carrying. The contrast is not dramatic. It is devastating. Germany had been cut off from overseas coffee imports by the Allied naval blockade since 1939. There were no Brazilian beans coming into Hamburg. There were no East African shipments arriving at Bremen. The Third Reich was a continental power trapped inside a continent, and the things that grew on continents did not include coffee. What the German soldier drank instead was called Ersatzkaffee, substitute coffee. The troops had a more honest name for it. They called it Muckefuck, a corruption of the French phrase mocha faux, meaning false coffee. It was made from roasted barley, rye, chicory root, and acorns. It contained no caffeine. It was brown. It was hot. It tasted, by every surviving account, like what it was, which was grain water with a bitter edge. The word Ersatz had been borrowed from German into English in the 19th century, but it gained widespread use during the First World War and became ubiquitous by the Second. Everything in the German economy was Ersatz by 1944. Ersatz rubber, Ersatz fuel, Ersatz coffee. The word became a synonym for a cheap imitation of the real thing, and no German soldier needed a dictionary to explain why. Real bean coffee, Bohnenkaffee, was a treasure on the German side. It was hoarded, hidden, traded on the black market, and prized far above its weight in currency. A packet of real coffee in Germany in 1944 was worth more than money, because money was increasingly worth nothing. Allied prisoners of war held in German camps were issued the same grain coffee, and their memoirs uniformly describe it as one of the small daily miseries of captivity. Not dangerous, not painful, just endlessly, grindingly disappointing. The tobacco situation was almost as bleak. The German military ration allocated approximately 6 cigarettes per day to each soldier, but this figure was a ceiling, not a guarantee. The National Socialist regime had conducted one of the most aggressive anti-tobacco campaigns in the modern world. Adolf Hitler personally despised smoking. He offered gold watches to associates who quit. The regime banned smoking in many public spaces, restricted tobacco advertising, prohibited the sale of cigarettes to women in restaurants and cafes, and used the Hitler Youth for anti-smoking education. The Reich limited additional cigarette purchases for soldiers to 50 per person per month. Yet a 1944 survey found that 87% of German servicemen smoked. The demand was enormous. The supply was strangled. German military tobacco came primarily from Turkey, and by 1944 the shipping routes were increasingly disrupted. By the spring of 1945, a German civilian's tobacco ration card might yield as few as 40 cigarettes per month. Frontline troops often received less. Compare this directly. An American private in the European theatre was carrying 12 cigarettes per day in his ration alone, with access to additional packs at the post exchange. A German private was officially allocated 6, could purchase 50 more per month if they were available, and increasingly could not get them at all. The American was drinking real coffee multiple times a day. The German was drinking grain water. The American's ration box contained chewing gum, hard candy, a fruit bar, chocolate, and processed cheese. The German was eating dark rye bread that was progressively stretched with fillers as the war went on, canned meat or sausage in quantities that decreased every quarter, and a thin portion of vegetables. This was not a gap, it was an abyss, and the men on both sides of it knew exactly what it meant. But the rations were only part of the story. The real question, the one that turned the gap into a verdict, was how those rations reached the foxhole. Because the most extraordinary thing about the American supply system was not what it carried, it was how far it carried it. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion force hit the beaches of Normandy. The scale of the logistics operation that supported that assault defies casual comprehension. Within 3 weeks, more than 1 million men were ashore. By the end of June, the over-the-beach and Mulberry Harbour operations had landed 170,000 vehicles, 7.5 million gallons of fuel, and 500,000 tons of supplies. Each of the 28 Allied divisions in the field consumed roughly 750 tons of supplies per day, every day, 7 days a week. That is 21,000 tons per day just for the divisions, before accounting for the Corps, Army, and theatre-level units behind them. Somewhere in those 21,000 daily tons were the K-Ration boxes, millions of them, stacked on pallets, loaded onto trucks, driven down muddy Norman lanes to company supply points where sergeants broke open the cases and handed out the little wax-coated boxes 3 at a time. Breakfast, dinner, supper, coffee, 12 cigarettes. The system was so vast and so efficient that a soldier fighting in a hedgerow outside Saint-Lô could open a box of Chesterfields that had been manufactured in Virginia, packed in a ration box in a factory in the Midwest, shipped to a port on the Atlantic seaboard, loaded onto a Liberty ship, carried across 3,000 miles of ocean, unloaded onto a beach that had been captured from the German army 6 weeks earlier, trucked forward to a supply dump, and delivered to his foxhole, all for a product that weighed less than an ounce. The logistics chain that put those 4 cigarettes into that soldier's hand was the same chain that put the artillery shells into the guns that were keeping him alive, and both ran without interruption. After the breakout from Normandy in late July and early August, the advance accelerated so fast that the supply lines could not keep up. The French railway system had been destroyed by Allied bombing. The nearest deep-water port, Cherbourg, had been demolished by the retreating Germans, and the armies were sprinting east toward the German border, burning fuel and ammunition faster than anyone had planned for. On August 25, 1944, after a 36-hour emergency planning session, the American military launched one of the most remarkable logistics operations in the history of warfare. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from American railroading. To red ball a shipment meant to send it express, top priority. The Army took the term and applied it to a highway. 2 parallel one-way roads were designated from the Normandy supply depots to the forward dump sites near the front. One road for outbound loaded trucks, one road for the return empties. Civilian traffic was banned. Military police guarded every intersection to ensure the trucks never had to stop. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks simultaneously, most of them 2.5-ton GMC cargo vehicles driven around the clock in 2-man teams. They were supposed to travel in convoys at 25 miles per hour, with 60 yards between vehicles. In practice, individual trucks left the loading docks as soon as they were full, and drove at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour through blackout conditions on roads that were cratered, muddy, and sometimes still under intermittent German fire. The Red Ball ran for 83 days, from August 25 to November 16, 1944, when the port of Antwerp finally opened. In that time, its drivers delivered 412,193 tons of supplies: fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment, replacement parts, and coffee, and cigarettes. The conditions were brutal. The trucks ran day and night through autumn rain and early winter cold. The roads were cratered by bombing and rutted by heavy traffic. Blackout regulations meant driving without headlights at speeds that would be reckless in daylight. The drivers ate their own K-Rations behind the wheel. They slept in shifts in the cab while their partner drove. When a truck broke down, which happened constantly given the pace, the drivers were expected to repair it on the spot or abandon it and catch a ride back to the depot. The round trip from the supply dumps near Cherbourg to the forward depots behind the front lines and back took roughly 54 hours. 3/4 of the Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated transportation corps units in an army that did not yet allow them to fight alongside white soldiers in combat. They made that grueling run day after day. They are among the most under-recognized contributors to the Allied victory in Europe, and their story deserves to be told fully in its own investigation. But for this one, the detail that matters is this. Those men were not just hauling gasoline and bullets, they were hauling K-Rations. They were hauling the coffee and the cigarettes and the chewing gum and the chocolate that the American military had decided, as a matter of explicit policy, that every soldier on the line would receive. The Red Ball drivers were delivering morale at 60 miles an hour, while the Americans were running 6,000 trucks on dedicated highways to keep their front lines supplied with real coffee and commercial-grade cigarettes. The German military was relying on something most people do not associate with the Wehrmacht at all: horses. The popular image of the German army is of panzer columns and mechanized infantry thundering across Europe in half-tracks and armored cars. The reality was starkly different. The German army in the Second World War employed a total of about 2.75 million horses and mules to haul supplies, carry equipment, and pull artillery pieces. Even in 1944, when the Americans had the Red Ball Express running 6,000 trucks around the clock on paved roads, a significant portion of German logistics still depended on horse-drawn wagons traveling on dirt tracks at the pace of a walking animal. When those horses were killed by air attack, captured by advancing armies, or simply starved because the fodder supply had collapsed along with everything else, the supplies they carried did not arrive. And the supplies that did not arrive included whatever thin ration of ersatz coffee and Turkish cigarettes the system was still able to provide. A dead horse on a muddy road in France did not just mean a lost animal. It meant a company of German soldiers somewhere ahead who would not receive their bread that day, or their 6 cigarettes, or their bag of roasted barley that they were supposed to pretend was coffee. The contrast is almost too stark to believe, but it is documented fact. On one side of the line, a dedicated highway system with military police at every intersection, 12,500 tons of supplies per day, including K-Rations with real Chesterfields and soluble Nestlé coffee. On the other side, horse-drawn carts on dirt roads, carrying black bread and muckafuck and 6 cigarettes when they arrived at all. If your father or grandfather or great-uncle served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theatre, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit? Where did they serve? What did they eat? What did they trade? What did they miss most from home? Those details matter. They are the texture of history that no official archive captures, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. The German reaction to American abundance is documented across multiple sources. From prisoner interrogations to captured diaries to the secret recordings that British intelligence made of senior German officers who did not know they were being listened to, the reaction was consistent. It was shock. Lieutenant Colonel Fritz Ziegelmann was a senior staff officer of the 352nd Infantry Division, the division that was defending Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944. From a position above the beach, Ziegelmann watched the Allied invasion fleet materialize out of the English Channel. Ships of every size and type, standing so close together that the sea itself seemed to have changed color. In his post-war account, Ziegelmann wrote that in his entire military career, he had never been so impressed by what he saw. He concluded that the war could not be won. Ziegelmann's reaction was about the fleet, about the sheer tonnage of men and machines crossing an ocean to assault a fortified coast. But the same reaction, scaled down to the individual level, played out thousands of times across the European theatre whenever German soldiers encountered American rations. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces overran multiple American positions and supply points. The entire German offensive plan for the Ardennes depended on capturing Allied fuel. German tanks did not have enough gasoline to reach their objectives unless they could seize American dumps along the way. Kampfgruppe Piper captured approximately 50,000 gallons of American gasoline at Bullingen on December 17, fuel that was critical to continuing their armored advance. But it was not the fuel that made the deepest impression on the German soldiers. It was everything else. Reports from the period describe German troops tearing into abandoned American bivouacs and consuming whatever food they found. These were soldiers who had been on winter rations, reduced portions of bread and canned meat, marching through freezing Ardennes forests on roads choked with snow. When they broke into American supply points and found stacked cases of K-Rations, C-Rations, chocolate bars, canned fruit, white bread from field bakeries, and cartons of cigarettes, the contrast was not just material, it was existential. Some of these soldiers had been living on reduced rations for weeks. Their bodies were unaccustomed to the richness of the American food, and accounts describe men becoming ill after eating too quickly, and too much of things their stomachs could no longer handle. The white bread was a particular symbol. German military bread, Kommissbrot, was a dark, dense, rye loaf that grew harder and more unpleasant as the war went on, increasingly stretched with potato flour, bran, and other grain substitutes to make the shrinking supply go further. American field bakeries, shipped across the Atlantic and set up behind the lines, were producing soft white bread daily. The image of a German soldier holding a slice of white American bread in a frozen Belgian forest, knowing that the army that baked it had brought the flour, the yeast, the ovens, and the bakers across an ocean, was the war in miniature. American prisoners captured during the Bulge noticed the contrast from the other direction. William Shapiro, an American medic taken prisoner during the offensive, later recalled that all the captured Americans remarked on the shabbiness of the German equipment when compared to American troops on the march. The Germans they saw were threadbare. Their vehicles were battered. Their rations were pitiful. The Americans, even as prisoners, could see that the army holding them was an army running on fumes. Cigarettes became the sharpest symbol of this divide. In the European theatre, and especially in occupied and post-war Germany, American cigarettes functioned as a parallel currency, not metaphorically. Literally, by the summer of 1945, a pack of 20 American cigarettes on the Berlin black market could reportedly fetch the equivalent of $30 or more at official exchange rates. A carton of Chesterfields might go for $75 to $90. American soldiers bought cartons at the post exchange for roughly 50 cents and could, if they chose, resell them for a profit that dwarfed their military pay. In July 1945, the Army's Berlin Finance Office paid out $1 million in soldier pay. That same month, soldiers in Berlin sent home $3 million. The difference was the cigarette economy. This was not a minor black market curiosity. It was a functioning monetary system. Economists have studied it as a textbook case of commodity money emerging spontaneously when official currency loses trust. R. A. Radford, a British economist who had himself been a prisoner of war, published a landmark paper in 1945 called The Economic Organization of a POW Camp that documented in precise detail how cigarettes became the standard unit of exchange among prisoners of multiple nationalities. A shirt was worth 80 cigarettes. A pair of boots could go for 150. Bread traded at fixed cigarette prices. The system had its own inflation when Red Cross parcels arrived, and deflation when they did not. It had its own exchange rates, its own market dynamics, its own speculators and profiteers. Radford's paper is still taught in economics courses today as a demonstration of how money works at its most basic level. In the wider German civilian economy, the cigarette standard lasted well beyond the war itself. Until the currency reform of 1948, when the new Deutsche Mark replaced the worthless Reichsmark, American cigarettes remained the most trusted medium of exchange in occupied Germany. A schoolteacher or a doctor might be paid in cigarettes. Rent could be settled in cartons. The entire economy of a defeated nation ran, for 3 years, on a product that the American army was handing out for free with breakfast. German prisoners of war who were shipped to the United States experienced the supply contrast in an even more concentrated form. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were to receive the same rations as the soldiers of the detaining power. This meant German prisoners in American camps ate the same food American soldiers ate, including white bread, fresh meat that was rationed for American civilians, and up to 2 packs of cigarettes a day. One German prisoner later recalled gaining 57 pounds in 2 years of American captivity. The prisoners were so well fed that it became a source of complaint among American civilians who read about it. But the effect on German prisoners was profound. These were men who had been fighting on black bread and ersatz coffee. To be handed real bacon, real eggs, real coffee, and 20 cigarettes a day by the army that had defeated them was to receive a daily lesson in why they had lost. The tobacco companies understood what was happening and poured fuel on it. During the war, American tobacco firms ran massive campaigns encouraging civilians to buy cigarettes and ship them to troops overseas. Camel's advertising claimed the brand was first in the service. Chesterfield, Lucky Strike, and Philip Morris all positioned themselves as patriotic necessities. The precedent had been set in the First World War, when General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, famously declared that the troops needed tobacco as much as bullets. In 1942, the American Tobacco Company changed Lucky Strike's famous dark green packaging to white and launched one of the most successful advertising slogans in American history. Lucky Strike Green has gone to war. The claim was that the chromium used in the green ink and the copper used in the gold trim were needed for the war effort. The truth, as later acknowledged, was that the redesign was primarily a marketing decision. The white pack tested better with female consumers. But tying the change to patriotism reportedly increased Lucky Strike sales by 38% in 6 weeks. The slogan was everywhere, and the cigarettes were on every battlefield. The depth of American abundance was not something the German High Command could process through their existing frameworks. Germany had always fed its army by a combination of domestic production and organized plunder. The Reich systematically stripped food from occupied territories. Historian Lizzie Collingham, in her study The Taste of War, estimated that roughly 40% of the bread and meat consumed by German military and civilian populations came from occupied nations and forced labor. This system held as long as Germany held territory. As the occupied zones shrank in 1944 and 1945, so did the food supply. Reich domestic bread rations fell from over 12,000 grams per period in May 1944 to just 3,600 grams by April 1945. Meat, fat, and vegetable rations collapsed along similar lines. The American system was the opposite. It did not depend on plunder. It depended on production. By 1945, the United States was manufacturing more than half of all produced goods in the world. The same industrial base that built nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war, the same factories that produced hundreds of thousands of trucks and tanks and ships, also produced the 290 billion cigarettes of 1943, the billions of D-Ration chocolate bars manufactured by Hershey, and the millions of K-Ration boxes assembled in packaging plants across the Midwest. The Hershey Chocolate Company alone produced ration chocolate on a scale that boggles the mind. The D-Ration bar, developed in collaboration with Army Quartermaster Captain Paul Logan beginning in 1937, was a 4-ounce block of chocolate fortified with oat flour and skim milk powder. It was deliberately designed to taste, in the specification's own words, a little better than a boiled potato, so soldiers would not eat it as a snack. Each bar delivered 600 calories. 3 bars made a day's emergency ration. Hershey ran production lines day and night. By the end of the war, the company had produced ration bars numbering in the billions. This industrial capacity translated into something at the squad level that no German logistician had ever planned against. It translated into a soldier who was, by any material measure, the best supplied infantry fighter in the history of the world. An American rifleman in 1944 was carrying more calories, more stimulant, more comfort items, and more tradable currency in his cargo pockets than a German rifleman could accumulate in a month. And the American did not think of it as exceptional. He thought of it as normal. He expected it. And when the supply system failed, as it occasionally did during the Bulge, his anger was the anger of a man whose standard had been violated, not the resignation of a man who had never had a standard in the first place. This is the part of the story that German generals talked about in private, when they believed no one was listening. Between 1942 and 1945, British intelligence operated one of the most remarkable eavesdropping operations of the entire war. At a converted manor house called Trent Park in North London, captured senior German officers were held in conditions designed to feel like comfortable detention. The food was good. There were chess sets and gardens and exercise privileges. The prisoners were given books and allowed the run of the grounds. They were treated with the courtesy due their rank. What they were not told was that every room in the house, including bedrooms and bathrooms, had been wired for sound. British intelligence officers, many of them German Jewish refugees who had fled the Nazi regime and now sat in basement rooms beneath the very floors the generals walked on, transcribed every conversation around the clock for years. The operation was run under the code designation MI-19. The transcribers were chosen specifically for their native fluency in German, their understanding of military terminology, and their ability to pick up the regional accents and personal speech patterns of the officers they were monitoring. The transcripts fill more than 1,300 protocols, later published by historian Sönke Neitzel in works including Tapping Hitler's Generals, published in 2007, and the companion volume Soldaten, co-authored with social psychologist Harold Welser, published in German in 2011 and in English translation the following year. These transcripts are among the most valuable primary source documents to come out of the entire Second World War, because they capture what German officers actually said to each other when they believed no one outside their circle could hear. In those transcripts, the captured generals returned again and again to the question of why the war was being lost. What is striking is what they emphasized when they believed the microphones were off. Their post-war memoirs would blame Hitler, blame the weather, blame the two-front war, blame the numerical superiority of the Soviets in the East. In private, at Trent Park, they talked about something more specific and more uncomfortable. They talked about Allied material superiority, not as an abstract concept, as a felt experience. As something that had broken the spirit of their troops at the individual level, one foxhole at a time. They described it as a weight that could not be lifted, a pressure that never stopped, an abundance on the other side of the line that made their own soldiers feel, in a way that no speech from Berlin could counteract, that the war was already decided. The gap in material wealth between the American soldier and the German soldier was not just a logistical fact, it was a psychological weapon. A German infantryman overrunning an American position and finding K-Rations with real coffee, real chocolate, real cigarettes and chewing gum was not just finding food, he was finding evidence. Evidence that the enemy he was fighting could afford to treat its lowest-ranking private like a human being who deserved comfort. Evidence that the country he was fighting against had resources so vast that it could ship luxury items across an ocean while simultaneously shipping tanks and planes and millions of tons of ammunition. Evidence, in the most concrete and personal form possible, that the war could not be won. German soldiers wrote about this in letters and diaries. The rations of a captured or killed American were prizes. The coffee was gold. A pack of Chesterfields could buy a German soldier favors, silence, and cooperation. The psychological effect compounded over time. Early in the war, when German rations were adequate and the victories were coming fast, the disparity was an irritant, something to joke about. By 1944, when German rations were shrinking and the defeats were mounting, the disparity was a verdict. Every American K-ration box torn open on a captured position was a small paper monument to a war that Germany had already lost. And here is the part that elevates this from a story about logistics into a story about philosophy. The American decision to include coffee and cigarettes in every ration was not an afterthought. It was a statement about what kind of army the United States intended to build. The Quartermaster Corps did not accidentally put Chesterfields in the K-ration. Ancel keys did not accidentally include a coffee packet in the breakfast unit. These items were placed there because the American military had concluded, from more than a century of experience stretching back to the 36 pounds of green beans issued to Union soldiers in the Civil War, that a fighting man who felt cared for would fight better than a fighting man who did not. The German military operated on a different principle. The Wehrmacht took pride in the fact that officers and enlisted men ate the same rations. There was equality in the system. What there was not was abundance. The German military philosophy held that the soldier should be hard, that comfort was weakness, that the will to fight came from ideology and discipline, not from a good meal and a cigarette. Adolf Hitler's personal abstinence from tobacco and alcohol was not merely a private quirk, it filtered into policy. The same regime that demanded total sacrifice from its soldiers actively restricted the one comfort item, tobacco, that 87% of those soldiers relied on. The regime spent resources on anti-smoking propaganda aimed at its own military, while simultaneously asking those same soldiers to hold positions against an enemy that had unlimited supplies of everything, including the very cigarettes the regime was trying to deny them. There is a parallel here to the broader story of the war. The German system excelled at many things: tactics, engineering, individual soldier training. What it failed at, catastrophically and repeatedly, was sustaining a war effort over time against opponents who could outproduce it. The same rigidity that prevented the German High Command from admitting that the Eastern Front was lost in 1943 prevented it from admitting that a soldier who had not had real coffee in 6 months was not going to fight as Prema. Well, as a soldier who had a fresh cup every morning. The system demanded willpower as a substitute for supply. It demanded sacrifice as a substitute for logistics. And when the willpower ran out, when the sacrifice had consumed everyone who had anything left to give, the system had nothing behind it, no reserves of morale, no depth of comfort to fall back on. Nothing but empty cups and empty packs and the taste of roasted barley in the back of the throat. The irony is as sharp as anything in the entire war. The American military, supposedly the soft army, the dollar army, the army of comfortable boys from a comfortable country, had built a supply system that treated every private as someone worth keeping happy. The German military, supposedly the warrior culture, the hard men of the Eastern Front, the soldiers who fought on will and discipline, had built a system that could not even give its own infantry a real cup of coffee. And here is what the German generals at Trent Park never quite said out loud, but kept circling around in conversation after conversation. The American abundance was not a symptom of softness. It was a symptom of strength. A country that can ship coffee across an ocean can ship anything across an ocean. A supply system that never forgets the cigarettes is a supply system that never forgets the artillery shells. A military that treats its privates as human beings is a military whose privates will fight without being forced to. The coffee and the cigarettes were not separate from the war effort. They were the war effort, delivered at the individual level, one K-Ration box at a time. The German army in 1944 was an army of brave men, fighting in an increasingly hopeless position. Many of them were courageous. Many of them were skilled. Many of them endured suffering that defies description. None of that is in dispute, but they were fighting inside a system that was consuming them. A system that could not feed them properly, could not supply them consistently, and could not provide them with the basic physical comforts that sustain morale over months and years of combat. They were drinking grain water while the Americans drank real coffee. They were scrounging for cigarette butts while the Americans were throwing away half-smoked Chesterfields. And they knew, each of them individually, in the way that soldiers always know, what that meant. The verdict on this investigation is not complicated. What kind of country gives every private soldier what a German sergeant cannot get? A country that has decided the private matters. Not as a number on a strength report, not as a replaceable component in a military machine, as a man who is cold and tired and scared and far from home, and who will fight better and longer and harder if someone in the supply chain has remembered that he needs a cup of coffee in the morning and a cigarette after dark. The American military in the Second World War was many things. It was chaotic. It was wasteful. It was imperfect in ways that fill volumes. Its treatment of its own African-American soldiers, including the Red Ball Express drivers who kept the entire logistics system running, was a stain that no amount of coffee and cigarettes can wash away. Its planning was sometimes terrible. Its early combat performance was often disastrous. This is not a story about perfection, but it is a story about a choice. The choice to put real coffee and real cigarettes in the pocket of every American soldier, from the general to the private, was a choice that said something about how the United States valued the individual human being inside the uniform. It was not a grand strategic decision. No one gave a speech about it. No president signed an executive order declaring cigarettes essential to national defense. It happened because the Quartermaster Corps, the supply officers, the ration designers, and the procurement bureaucrats shared a quiet assumption that was so deeply American they never had to articulate it. The man doing the work deserves to be taken care of. The man at the bottom of the system is still a man. The German army never made that assumption, not because its officers were cruel, though some were, not because its system was incompetent, though by 1944 it was failing. Because the culture that built the German military in the 20th century did not place the individual soldier's comfort at the center of the equation. It placed the mission at the center. It placed obedience at the center. It placed the will of the state at the center, and it expected the soldier to endure whatever the state could not or would not provide. That difference, visible in something as small as a 4-pack of Chesterfields tucked into a wax-coated cardboard box, decided more about the outcome of the war than most people will ever know. Every detail in this script is drawn from documented sources. Fritz Ziegelmann was a staff officer of the 352nd Infantry Division and authored a detailed post-war account of the division's defense of Omaha Beach. His reaction to the Allied invasion fleet is recorded in multiple secondary sources, including Stephen Ambrose's Citizen Soldiers. The K-Ration was designed by Ancel at the University of Minnesota in 1941. He died in 2004 at the age of 100. The Red Ball Express ran from August 25 to November 16, 1944, delivered 412,193 tons of supplies, and was operated primarily by African American soldiers in segregated transportation corps units. The 36 pounds of coffee per Union soldier per year is documented by the Smithsonian and the American Battlefield Trust. The 290 billion cigarettes produced in 1943 is confirmed by contemporary industry records and multiple historians. The 6-cigarette daily ration for German soldiers and the regime's anti-tobacco policies are documented in studies of the Nazi anti-smoking campaign. The Trent Park recordings are real, published by Sönke Neitzel, and contain extensive discussions of Allied material superiority by captured German officers. The K-Ration contents described in the opening, the coffee, the cigarettes, the cheese, the biscuits, the chewing gum, they were standard issue in every K-Ration box produced from 1942 onward. The arithmetic of 144 cigarettes per squad per day is accurate. The capture of Bullingen by Kampfgruppe Piper on December 17, 1944, including the seizure of approximately 50,000 gallons of American fuel, is documented across multiple official histories. There is an anecdote that circulates widely online about a German officer who found a birthday cake shipped from America to an individual soldier on a supply ship and instantly knew the war was lost. It is a powerful story. It is also fiction. It originates from the 1965 film Battle of the Bulge and does not appear in any primary source document. It is not included here because this channel does not present movie dialogue as history. What is real is this. The American soldier of the Second World War was the best supplied fighting man the world had ever seen. Not the best trained, not always the best led, not the most experienced, the best supplied. And the supply included things that most military planners would have dismissed as trivial: coffee, cigarettes, chewing gum, candy, small, light, cheap items that weighed almost nothing, cost almost nothing relative to a tank or an airplane, and meant everything to a young man sitting in a hole in the ground, 10,000 miles from home in the middle of winter. The men who designed that system, the quartermaster officers and the supply planners and the ration developers, never became famous. None of them received the Medal of Honor. None of them are remembered in the way that Patton and Eisenhower and Bradley are remembered, but they understood something that the German High Command, for all its tactical brilliance, never grasped. War is fought by human beings. Human beings need coffee in the morning. They need a cigarette when the shelling stops. They need to feel, even in the worst moments, that somebody back home remembers they exist and has put something in a box to prove it. The German soldiers standing in the snow at Bullingen that December morning, holding open K-Ration boxes and staring at 12 cigarettes they could not believe were real, already knew the answer to their own question. They knew what kind of country could afford this, a country that was going to win. If this investigation gave you something to think about, if it showed you a piece of the war you had not considered before, subscribe for the next chapter. There are many more of these stories. Most of them are about the things that do not make it into the highlight reels, the supply trucks and the ration boxes, and the men who drove through the night to make sure a private in a foxhole had coffee in the morning. Those men deserve to be remembered too, and the best way to remember them is to tell the truth about what they carried and why it mattered.